Recording begins. My audio is being recorded separately. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of I Read This Book. In this episode, I'm so happy to have Mr. K. Srikrishna join me. He is the author of the book, The Art of a Happy Exit. It's a beautiful book about how to make a successful exit as an entrepreneur, how you're trying to move away. And Mr. Sri Krishna is already is a serial entrepreneur himself. He's mentored, advised, invested in many companies, and has run his own. And he's now teaching at a university in US. I believe he's joining me from US. Are you, sir? Is it true?
Yes, I'm in Boston right now. Yes.
Welcome to I Read This Book, sir. We are so happy to have you and this lovely book of yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a joy to be here.
So, sir, I would like to ask you, every writer wants to write something, and we all say that we have a story. Everybody has one good book in him, and you chose to write this book, The Art of a Happy Exit. What was the prime driver for you to start this project?
Firstly, thank you for having me here. Every time this question is posed to me, I have to think about it twice. There were two incentives. As with all good engineers, I was trying to avoid something else. So when I first sold my company, during that period, I was part of a small entrepreneur group where we would talk to each other about our problems, what have you. And my best buddy, Ramani is his name, we used to walk every morning and discuss. He has a manufacturing business, and I ran the software business. At least, he thought I ran a software business, and we would talk about our businesses. So when I sold that first business, he was flummoxed. That is, hey, I know you just started making profit. I've been running this business for 20 years. You've been running this for 6 or 7 years. How did this happen? So there's a story here. You should tell the story. Obviously, people feel good if someone tells you, hey, you should tell your story. But in a rare moment of humility, let's say, which hit me for a second, I thought, hey, what is there really to tell in my own story? And so at that point, I thought, what would be more interesting? And when I spoke with him, it turned out what really intrigued him was about selling the business. What took to sell the business, what have you. And one of my own pet peeves, which, at every chance that I get, I talk much like in this meeting here, is both in India and the US, many times media seems to focus very heavily on when you raise money, right? Or when you sell, they say, oh, Redbus sold for $105 million or whatever it is. So it almost seems like the entire thing is reduced to one number. And then obviously there's all kinds of judgments of whether that number is a good number, bad number. There's lots of, if you will, armchair quarterbacks, if you want to call it, right? So my intent was to really, I thought, are these people happy? Because as I work with entrepreneurs, as I mentor young companies, etc., you see there's great passion when they start up. They want to change the world. And then when they exit, surprisingly, not all of them are happy. Again, happy is a highly subjective, it's not a scientific term. So I thought, hey, this will be much more interesting to explore. The other thing is I had been part of a nonprofit that was promoting entrepreneurship in India, the National Entrepreneurship Network. And one of the challenges, again, I saw was, look, Delhi and Bangalore and Delhi and Chennai, the ecosystems are so different. So I was sort of curious also, would entrepreneurial exits look different in different ecosystems? So would it be different in the Valley versus would it be different in India? Even within India, there are obviously different micro ecosystems, if you will, right? So these were the two primary motivations for me. I guess also crossing 50 probably helped, because whenever I talk to a young entrepreneur and we said, hey, don't focus on the money, try to have clarity on what is it that you're trying to get done. Many of their feelings, hey, you made your money. That's the reason, you're giving me this yarn here. But the reality, so I thought it's better that I talk to other people and share their stories of why is it that are all entrepreneurs happy because they made lots of money? What made it, if they were not happy, why were they not happy? And obviously discovering this whole entrepreneurial or a seller's remorse. So here, one of the challenges with seller's remorse is everybody thinks I made a lot of money, but if I'm not happy, I can't tell anybody, because if I told you, hey, Nishant, I'm not happy, you're like, what the hell? You just made a lot of money. What are you complaining about, right? So those were the two primary motivations for me, which is, look, are people actually happy when they sell their businesses? And is there a story there besides the money? And as I suspected, money is a very small component of whether you're happy or not.
We talk about the eventual exit and the accompanying happiness. But before that, I'd like to ask you a personal question. So I started my first company when I was in first year of college. And by the time we were graduating, we were doing like 1.5 crore rupees in revenue. And we were doing something where we started an office in Mumbai as well. That was the first company that we built. And our objective as entrepreneurs was never to sell out. In fact, we got an acquisition offer,
Right.
two acquisition offers. We turned them down because as young entrepreneurs living in India, perhaps it's an Indian concept which I'm talking about, but we always think about the legacy aspect of it, right? The build to last thing. Maybe we read the
Right.
wrong books. I read the wrong books, but it's that aspect where you build to last. So don't you think, or did you not encounter something like that? Or what are your thoughts about that mindset as such, the whole build to last aspect of it? Is entrepreneurship a selling oriented game? Because a lot of entrepreneurs, very good entrepreneurs, say that value creators are not the people who look for exits. That's also a state of thought, a school of opinion. What's your opinion on that entire scheme of things?
Okay, excellent question, Nishant. So I very much started where you did, and that is where I still am, right? And in fact, I'd go the other way. I think it's a myth of, oh, people flip businesses, they get it with. See, at the end of the day, let's start at the end. So I'll take the opposite view just for a second. Let's say the two of us decide to start a business with the sole goal of, look, within 18 months or 24 months or 60 months, doesn't matter what it is, we'll flip it, we'll make a shit ton of money for ourselves, and woo, we'll be happy, right? And the reality, and you've done this before, what you'll find is, look, if that's your goal, great, and there's no value judgment. See, one of my biggest concerns with the question that you posed, much like any question all of us pose, is it lies in a context, and that there is a context of judgment.
Yeah.
Which is, geez, if the guy flipped, is that bad? If the guy never flipped but passed it on to his daughters, is that good, or was he stupid and didn't make money? So going back to the Red Bus example, when Red Bus did sell, there was a whole bunch of people questioning, saying, why didn't they wait to be, $1 billion rather than sell it for 115 million? Right? And if you talk to Funny didn't start the business with the intent of flipping it in any manner. In fact, like every business, Red Bus probably died multiple times before it really got traction. And they looked at, and they worked on a really hard problem. So without getting into the details of that. So to your specific question, when I started my business along with my co-founders, I had 4 co-founders. They were 23. I was the old dude at 34, right? And our goal was very, very simple. Our vision was very, very simple. I had an epiphany. I'd been on a sales call to Israel, and I was sitting across from a company called DSP Communications. And they had DSP engineers, digital signal processing engineers. I had digital signal processing engineers. And it was very clear in that conversation that their engineers were just as good as mine, if you will. So it's not a question of mine were just as good as his. Theirs were just as good as us. But they were billing $1 million per engineer, and I was billing $60,000 per engineer. So I go like, what's the gap here, right? Clearly. So our intent was, look, we're leaving a lot of money on the table. By we, I don't mean just us, but the sense of, hey, so how can we build a Sony or a HP out of India? That was the vision we started with.
Beautiful vision.
Right? So the idea was there was no intent. So we were really looking build to last. Again, we read some of the same books that you've read, clearly. But independent of that, so the legacy aspect was really on an even grander scale. Can we build something of pride for the nation? Right? I'm not saying we are selfless or we didn't think about, of course, time showed that we were clueless. We had no idea what the hell we're doing. We had no realization that we were building technology that we were incapable of building. We had no idea that the world wasn't ready. Thrice in my business, we built a product that was 10 years too early, right? So we made every possible mistake. So that's sort of where we started, which is, can we build something, forget passing it on to somebody. I mean, it's generations. That's sort of where we started. The amazing thing for us is in the 4 years, we made so many mistakes that could have killed us. Luckily, none of them killed us. I mean, I think we had a semi-annual death event or near-death event of one sort or the other.
Of course.
But in the meantime, we started off purely luck at an area where technology was booming. It was, again, Bluetooth in 99. Everyone felt it's going to die. At least 3 times they said it was going to die because, it's not low enough power. No one's going to want it. Wi-Fi is going to kill it. You name it. Every kind of reason why it was going to be dead. And we stuck with it, if you will, right? Because obviously we're trying to build something for the decades, not just for the, right? But what happened in the marketplace is the market got consolidated end to end. When you look at new technology, there are many players. There's an entire path of people who are creating the IP, people who are creating software, people who are creating chips. You put those on a modules, those modules go into an ODM, that goes into an OEM, that goes into an end brand, and then the retail channel, if you will, right? So suddenly people at either end are buying up everybody in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So here we were suddenly this little minnow in this ocean. So either now we need to jump into a new pond, or we should do the buying, integrating forward or backward. And in fact, that's one of the things we did set out to say, we will integrate forward. I mean, so our customers were concerned. Here we are $2 million company. Our customers are $1 billion companies. But the moment they hear us saying, oh, we are also going to enter the retail business, they're like, oh, wait a second. How can I buy from you? Right? So what happens at that point? Then you're faced with a choice. Now, by this time, my partners have, their first wife, maybe first baby, first house, and families are asking, what the hell are you guys doing? I mean, do you have any intention of making any money at the time? How am I going to make bills? So people have been with us 6 or 7 years. So suddenly now you have a choice to make. What do you do? People on all sides of you are getting acquired. Forget the monetary. It's a question of survival now.
Mm-hmm.
So now you look at saying, what is the right way? So we did have a plan B. We went and started up a retail-focused company in Singapore called Hippo Lifestyles. But of course, our customers were saying, oh, now you're going to compete with us. And we're like, wait a second, where are we competing with you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, we had a choice to make, which is, what is the right decision? Do we now exit and fight another day? And by the way, just because you want to exit doesn't mean an exit is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, we got around the table and we said, look, if we go down this second path now, which is integrate forwards, it's going to be another 4 or 5 years of really busting our ass. And again, keep in mind, 2005 was very different than 2021.
It was.
Right. And certainly was very different even from 2015 or 2010. It was a whole nother era, if you will, in the Indian context.
Absolutely.
So at that point, we said, look, it's much better that we try and find a partner. See, so there were 3 options. Restart over in a new area, possibly die unheard of and unheralded,
Mm-hmm.
or potentially leverage the technology that we have to try and get acquired.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the path we went, right? And after that, after our 2 years was up,
Mm-hmm.
each of us, both my founders went off to found another startup that's grown amazingly large. I don't know if you know, there's a company called Amagi.
No,
so
I have
they
not
raised
heard.
about $40 or $50 million.
Wow.
And they've grown. I went in a slightly different direction after that. I wanted to really do something small. So just like when we're talking about books, one book which greatly impressed me was one called Small Giants.
Small Giants.
Which is, why should businesses grow? I mean, that was my motivation, which is, why are we constantly buying into this, what my daughters would now call capitalism, of that, the purpose of business is to grow.
Mm-hmm.
Why not build a business? And I'm not talking about lifestyle business, but a nice business that can be what they call a small giant.
Mm-hmm.
So I went in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think, I think one of the things I'm very clear about is there is a judgment built into this question where we feel, oh my God, if he sold, either he's smart and got out, or if he didn't build a legacy business. Because India has, not just India, 99% of businesses, right, are not venture funded globally.
Of course.
Less than 1%, 0.9% are venture funded in the US, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But they probably get 99% of the media coverage.
They will.
Whereas the remainder who are building. So if I look at every Marwari businessman or every Sindh businessman or every Chettiar in Tamil Nadu who build businesses, they've all built legacy businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So family businesses are mostly how they go, and most of them build legacy, and they certainly at least survive a couple of generations. So I think this is a choice and a journey that you don't always, we like to think we are in control, but we aren't really in control. So regardless of the choice you make, that doesn't mean you will necessarily end up there. But I don't think there's a judgment in either one of these.
I'd like to say something. So I've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs, and since I've been in this, I have, all of them have a very solid, very, very real perspective, very grounded perspective on things. But not all are able to articulate it as you do so. I mean, your articulation is fantastic. Maybe it's the teaching background that you have. It's beautiful. Listening to you is very nice. I want to.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I had this when you were talking to entrepreneurs about the book. So obviously, the only way you could write the book is by reaching out to the near and dear ones, the people you know. But was there a method behind that? I mean, how are you sorting the entrepreneurs? That there's founders of Donato, there's Redbus, there's other people. How did you come to choose the set of entrepreneurs that are featured in the book?
Okay. It looks like today is my day to disagree with you on a variety of things, which is a good thing, right? If we agree all the time, it's not so much fun, right? So I made an effort. In fact, most of the entrepreneurs in the book, I did not know prior to interviewing them for the book.
Wow.
Okay. So there are two things that drove me. One is I wanted to get at least 5 to 10 entrepreneurs from at least 3 different ecosystems,
Okay.
right? So the two ecosystems were natural and very clear. One is obviously India, which is where I built my business, which is where I was living, what have you. The other was really the Valley, because this is sort of seems to be the Mecca, if you will, when people talk about startups, entrepreneurs, what have you. Entirely happenstance, due to family reasons, I ended up in Westerville, Ohio, which was not something I had planned, which is I had planned to take a 2-month break when my daughter went to school at the Ohio State. So I followed her there. I looked at it as a nice break. At this time, I had semi-retired in Bangalore. I'd lived in Bangalore for 10 years. And then I got there, and luckily I listened to my wife. She said, look, I don't want you sitting around the house, keep yourself busy in some manner. So I went over to the local entrepreneur circuit to see, hey, what's happening out here? And I was very pleasantly surprised for 2 reasons, right? Again, one of my pet peeves is I'm not a big believer in, okay, build something, never mind, get the audience, then we'll figure out the business model. I'm an old school businessman, if you want to call it that, right? I like customers. I like customers who pay me. I don't necessarily want VCs to underwrite my, right? Again, nothing against venture capital. What I'm saying is that there has to be a real business. And that's sort of what I found in Ohio, right? And again, I don't think we don't necessarily, I'm sure you have not necessarily thought about, let's go live in Auckland, New Zealand, or some such place, right? So there was a certain accident, if you will, that I found myself in the Midwest. And I was an idiot. In that 20 years I lived in California, obviously I thought I knew the US, I traveled the world, etc. But the reality is the US is not California. It's much like saying, okay, if I lived in Tiruchirappalli and I think I know that's India, clearly, you just have to go a couple of 100 miles and it's very different. So in the Midwest, I found a very different entrepreneurial ecosystem, and I was curious to see what that is, right? And one of the challenges, one of the advantages, at that time I was teaching at the Ohio State University, which is the Harvard of Ohio in one sense. So people always thought I must be a smart guy if I'm teaching there. So they were quite keen to talk to me, and they in turn referred me to other people. But I think the one thing that was not met, just to round off this answer, is early on, I showed some of what I was doing to my daughters, and they were not happy. They said, Dad, there just aren't enough women entrepreneurs here, right? And one of the things was, for the book, I put a constraint for myself, that is, whoever I spoke to should have sold their business at least 4 years earlier, so that they have sufficient distance between the exit event and the time I spoke to them, so that they're able to talk to it. And the funny thing was, I was able to look at a lot more women entrepreneurs in India who had exited than in the Valley. But it also turned out many of the entrepreneurs that I pursued in India were already in the midst of their second or third startup, and they just couldn't, I don't know if I'm a particularly scary guy, but in terms of the timelines I was working with. So while about a third of the entrepreneurs in the book are women, there aren't clearly as many as I would have liked in the book, because obviously their perspectives could be, again, certain things are not any different. Certain things are a different set of challenges here, right? And of course, I think the hard lesson, again, you've been in business. So like any entrepreneur, whenever I spoke to somebody, I'd ask them, hey, can you refer me to a couple of people?
Of course.
Right? And similarly, when I reached out to a lawyer or a VC or other angels, then in turn, I asked them to introduce me to other people. So the advantage was, yes, there was connectivity, but the connectivity wasn't necessarily directly with me. The other part is, obviously, I wanted to try and get, and this I was very lucky, some of it was happenstance, is my background is tech. I know a lot of people in tech, both in the Valley as well as in India. But the challenge is what's true for tech necessarily true elsewhere, right? So that's why I got lucky in talking to people in advertising, people in marketing, people in manufacturing, you name it. Almost 10 or 12 different industries I spoke with. So that's sort of how I went about that. Again, just like with entrepreneurship, right? There's an element of luck involved in all of this. So I'd like to tell you, I had a grand strategy and that's how it worked. The reality is you start one place, you start pulling a string, it takes you places. If you're smart, you jump on it and you try to make the best that you can out of it.
Beautifully said. This is exactly the thing which we talked about in our last episode when I was talking to Mr. Rao. And his book, I don't know if you've read it, How I Almost Blew It, was
The web chutney story, isn't it?
yes. The web
Yes.
chutney guy wrote the book, How I Almost Blew It. It's not necessarily a web chutney story because he rarely talks about it himself in the book. But yes,
Right.
he does mention his stories in the middle of the featured stories. And
Right.
the entire concept of his book was luck and chance outcomes and how they.
Right.
So I am so happy to hear that from you as well. Why I asked this question was, Mr. Srikrishna, because yours is a typically difficult topic. So when, let's say, the Inheritors was written about family businesses, so it's easy to find businesses which are old and which have been in business and who have chance on the generation. How I Almost Blew It was about internet entrepreneurs in a way. Yours
Right.
is anybody who has sold a business, and it must have been hard to categorize it. Now I know that you categorized it on a lot of factors, including women entrepreneurs and other things like the geographical ecosystem that you mentioned. So
Right.
that was the reason I was very curious on the curation of the list that you came about, and it was it. Now I will, at the risk of repeating myself, I'd ask you a question which we've talked about already before we hit the
Right.
record button. And it was about the reception of this beautiful book. Uh, I mean, what are your hopes when you wrote this book? We all have a good story in us. It's a saying amongst writers that everybody has one good book in him. And you've written this, and what are your expectations as far as reception is concerned? What are you aiming for, and how has it been so far?
Okay. The first time you posed this question, I gave you a little slightly more polite answer. So I'll tell you the raw answer, if you will, right? Certainly for myself, I have more than one book in me. So I'm quite clear, right? But I think just like I've also successfully killed two businesses, right? I mean, nothing builds humility like failing, if you will.
That
Of
is
course, my
true.
father reminded me that businesses fail, entrepreneurs don't necessarily fail, right? And what's even more humbling is when you
I'm
fail.
so sorry. I'm so sorry. Just on
Yes.
this quote, I'd like to interrupt you. And I was I was having a word with Mr. Hitesh Oberoi a few days back, the
Uh-huh.
co-founder of Naukri,
Right.
and he asked me, Nishant, how's it going? And I said, sir, it's been uh, difficult times, as you can imagine. And
Right.
he said, and I quote, Nishant, tough times don't last, tough people do.
Right.
And your statement came in ringing. So sorry, sir. Please, back at you.
No, not at all. Right. So the thing is, I think it's all appropriate because again, what's the point of saying we are entrepreneurs and there's some lessons learned if we can't apply it in other spheres of our life, right? So to the way some measures, right, to speak quite bluntly here is, as you learn, expectations are just because you want something doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen. So one of the lessons I've learned teaching is the way I measure myself at teaching is, look, will I impact one student's life? Not necessarily one student in this batch, not necessarily one student from last year, right? Will I impact one student's life? It's not setting the bar low because all it takes, if that one student impacts 10,000 people, then your life's work is done. Of course, one way of hedging that is if you impact hundreds of students' lives, the probability that one of them is going to impact in a big time, right? So in many ways, I think it's important to recognize we are instruments, right? And I don't mean that we don't have control or what have you. So to me, when I look at this book, clearly the people that I have high regard for have had positive things to say about it first, right? So that to me is already validation, if you will, right? So obviously my publisher has a goal that he wants to sell n number of books. I am amply clear. So my goal is not, and I also realize now, and that's the reason I brought up James Clear. So if you look at James Clear, or if you look at Gary Vaynerchuk as an example, right?
Okay.
In both these cases, they became overnight successes after 10 years or after 5 years, as both of them point out. They were an overnight success because you became aware of them. But they were busting their ass for the previous 5 years or 10 years or what have you before they became overnight success. So most books, as we spoke about, right, sell less than 1,000 copies. And the books that really do well are not the ones that just have a boom at the beginning, right? Obviously, if President Obama writes a book, never mind what he wrote, it's going to sell out before it's out there, right? And I think now if Prince, I forget his name, Harry, I guess, right, writes a book, I'm sure it's sold even before anything happens. But most books have a long tail. That's the beauty about books. And the lesson that I've learned, and the reason you and I are talking here today, right? We didn't know either one of us existed 3 months ago, 90 days ago, right?
We didn't.
And
That's
clearly a whole slew of people's lives are being touched because most entrepreneurs are not thinking, oh, should I exit? Or even the ones who are thinking, should I exit, are not thinking, will I be happy? It's almost a given that I'll be happy. So my expectation for this book is obviously I would like everyone who's either an entrepreneur or thinking of being an entrepreneur to read it. And more importantly, I would like people in the ecosystem, because again, to me, if only journalists read it, I would deem it a success because again, I return to my pet peeve of reducing the entire entrepreneurial journey to a number or making this only about commercial dollars and figures rather than lives touched, rather than lessons learned, right? I think that I see many different audiences for whom this can have a huge impact, not because it'll transform their lives, but their ability to impact other people's lives. That's really my aspiration for this book, which is, in one sense, the reason I'm here today, the reason you're talking about is, let's say only your mom and one other person ever listens to anything you do. That we already doubled the number of people who are listening to from here, right? And at the next level, we know from Twitter and we know from LinkedIn, if people are retweeting or liking, at the very least, people have become aware. So my expectation is really, and again, at the beginning, you asked me a question, which is, let me answer both of those together, right? So one way to write this book, there are multiplicity of ways to write these books, right? One is just a set of stories. So if you look at Jessica Livingston's book, for example, it's a series of stories of entrepreneurs, and you make whatever you want of it, if you want, right?
Which one
the other way to say is, I'm sorry?
Which one are you talking about, sir? Jessica Livingston?
So Jessica Livingston from, I'm sorry, it'll come to me in a second. So she wrote the story of 20 entrepreneurs who have been through YC, right? Through Y Combinator.
All right.
So she's one of the co-founders of Y Combinator.
Oh.
And by the way, that's an excellent book. You should get it and read it. I'll send you a link on Goodreads that you can take a look at it. I'm sorry that this is one of the challenges as you get beyond 50, then things start missing here and there, and you have to sort of reach out for that, right?
Trust me, sir, but it happens in 20s as well. So
now you tell me, right? And I think through the pandemic, pandemic has done a lot for our gray cells. Not all of them good. But to come back to your point, one is you tell the stories and that's it, right? The reader takes whatever they want from it. The other extreme is you want to sell your book. Here's the mechanics of how to sell your book, right? How do you find an intermediary? How do you find prospective people? How do you negotiate? What do you do in terms of contract, etc.? So what I tried to do was try and sort of do a book that's in the middle, which is, yes, if all you want is read through the stories and yes, you felt good, right? And you felt you read something. Alternately, how can I actually apply? I mean, this is much like reading the Gita or the Bible. Yes, if you're a jnani, you take whatever you want from it. But if you're like me, then it's sort of nice to have a checklist to say, hey, how do I actionize this? What do I do tomorrow morning? What do I do next month? What do I do in my annual review? So that's the sort of thing. So on one hand, so people could choose to read only the stories and that's it. They had a good time and they're inspired either because of, and these stories luckily are stories of other entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs in multiple milieux, if you will. Alternatively, you say, okay, all this is great, but how the hell do I do what's coming up for me, right? I've already had several calls with entrepreneurs, some that I've mentored, some out of the blue who saw the book and then reached out to me to say, so they had questions like, oh my God, my angels keep asking me about exits. How do I answer that question, right? And recently I had a call with somebody who said, we want to have a conversation with our angels about exits. How should we do that, right? So I think once we are beginning to have these sorts of dialogues, then as an author, I'm quite happy. I mean, of course, I think my wife would be ecstatic if we sold tens of thousands of copies. And I would be happy as well. But I'm already happy is what I'm saying.
Beautiful. I actually talked to Kashyap Devra, who wrote Golden Tap. If you've read about that book, beautiful.
Yes.
One of the best books. Absolutely wonderful. So when I was talking to him, he said that I was talking to a great writer, and he told me that Kashyap, a book has a life cycle where if it sells for the first 6 months well, it keeps selling for the lifetime. it keeps selling forever. So the long tail that you talked about, books have a phenomenal long tail. If they, as you said, don't get lost in those books which don't sell beyond 1,000 copies. If it somehow
Right.
clicks, it clicks, and I hope that this one does as well. Now, when I was looking
Just
at
a moment.
uh
Just a moment. Sorry. The name of that book is Entrepreneurs at Work.
Entrepreneurs at Work, all right, I have
Jessica
noted
Livingston.
Jessica Livingston. I will definitely get it on, and I'll share my review with it with you. So, my question is, when you were curating the beauty of this book is that the stories are not very positive, quintessentially. They are sad stories somehow. Sometimes, many of them are a little like heart wrenching stories where an entrepreneur actually had a very tough time, and he was not happy with the progress of like the whole progression where things happen. And I know that this is how it's supposed to be. The book is supposed to tell you the difficult parts of life. It's not supposed to be a collection of success stories so that people don't know what goes wrong. I know that this was the best way to deal with the subject, but are you scared that it might put off your readers because the tone becomes somber for a little while?
So
While
firstly, interesting question, right? Again, one of the things I tell my students is listen to the customer. You don't have to necessarily like it. So if you tell me that's how it came across, then I must accept it as such. But there are 2 points that I'd like to, again, I don't mind disagreeing with my customers, so I shall do so, right?
Mhm.
First is every one of these entrepreneurs, and I'll tell you, and some stories are even worse than you would think, and I come to that in a second, is every entrepreneur in the book is happy, but for very different reasons than what the reader does.
Mhm.
So I don't think any of them failed. And I don't say that because I'm a particularly polite guy,
Mhm.
right? Or even any of their businesses necessarily failed. So I'm not sure that any of these would constitute failures in the classical sense. The real issue is that thus far, there's been a tale. See, this is again, my partner Bhaskar used to say, he's the guy who runs Amagi now, is once you're successful, you can tell your story any way you want.
True
Right? And
that.
there are two aspects to this. One is just memory fails. And obviously, we tend to remember the pleasant parts and not the unpleasant parts, right?
Mhm.
Because otherwise, we would never stay sane, right?
Mhm.
Look at how we managed through the pandemic. There have been really hard times. Yet we are all looking for that silver lining if we want to get out the other side.
All right.
So again, in fact, you tempt me to pose a question back to you, and maybe we take that offline, or if appropriate, we can take it on here.
Mhm.
No, it has not even occurred to me. And in fact, I would argue with you now, or any point in the future, right, that these stories are quite redeeming. And I'll share one particular instance. It was early March 2019. So one of the entrepreneurs in the book, I was interviewing them. I had never met her before. We've been introduced to by a VC. And in fact, she was quite honest and said, hey, I may not have taken your call because I did not have a good experience with the gentleman who introduced you to me.
Mhm. Oh,
Right.
okay.
And then over the next 45 minutes, she started telling me her tale. She ran her business for 14 years. She conceived it. This was someone who had not only been working for 12 years before she went to business school, but she won the business plan competition at Wharton Business School. So we're not talking about some, random business school, if you will.
I read the book. Yeah, I
Right.
remember
And
the
then she
story.
runs a business for 14 years, out of which she effectively gets nudged out.
Mhm. Yeah, that
Right.
was
So
a very
she's not only,
difficult story.
right.
Yeah,
And
yes.
then while we are on the phone, she tells me, something that's going on in her personal life. Uh, and I had to sit down. Usually when I'm on the phone, I'm walking and talking to
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
So when she said all this, I had to sit down. Then I said, and remember, this is a person I had never met before. Then I said, forgive me for asking this, but how the hell are you holding up? I mean, because if I was going through this, I'd be raving and ranting,
Mhm.
right? And it was very clear. So what really struck me, and this is Laura Bennett in the book, is
Mhm.
the equanimity that she had.
Mhm.
Right? And that comes from distance. That obviously comes from a personality, of course, right? I mean, you got to be because you could choose to be unhappy about it and upset with the whole world,
Mhm.
right? And obviously, since then, she's done very well, what
Mhm.
have you. And if you look at R.T. Isaac, he clearly says, look, after he sold his business, he sat for 3 months in his empty office because he was still had the lease was in his name and he
Mhm.
had bills to pay.
Yeah,
right? So
man,
if
that
after
was
selling
tough
his
to
business, so
read.
but
That was
so
something.
the thing is, I think when we look at these at the first time when we encounter it, just like in that experience I spoke about on the phone call, or you posing this question, it tells more about us than about them.
Uh-huh.
And then when you get a little time and you say, wait a second, how did they deal with it? Where are they now?
Mm-hmm.
And again, this failure or success is very narrow temporal. So my view is actually, I find almost every story in this book, by the way, obviously, clearly I'm biased.
Of course.
Excuse me, right?
Understandably.
Pardon me. So I'd be curious to see, no, so the thought never even occurred to me that this is going to send people, right? In fact, if the message I'm hoping people will take away is, look, business is not about money. In fact, money, while money is important and money makes the world go around, blah, blah, blah. The reality is whether you're happy or not really depends on what is it that you want? What is it the people around you want?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you go about that whole thing? So to me, it's a very, in fact, it gives you a lot more control because there's going to be times, and that's the only certainty when you run a business, is shit's going to hit the fan. You're not going to make money. You're not going to be able to make payroll.
Mm-hmm.
All kinds of crap is going to happen. But if these people can come out of it happy and growing and subsequently successful repeatedly,
Mm-hmm.
then
So
there
can
is no real failure here in that sense.
I understand. So that's like very, 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 very beautifully answered. My hats off to you. I look. I'm a very, very real person. I knew entrepreneurship is hard, and I understand that when you're telling the lessons, you need to tell them as they are. You got to say it how it is, because you can't sugarcoat the truth. But I genuinely had that question, and I'm so glad that you answered it very well. I This conversation is so, yeah, yes sir.
Sorry, Nishant, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
Did you find that this is getting you down? Like, oh my God, you can do all this shit and still good things not happen? I mean, did the book bring you
So
down?
no, sir. I'll tell you my story. So I started my company, as I said, in college, and then we were doing well, and then we made three products, one after each other, which failed. We had like sunk 40 lakhs in the team, in those products. Then my core business fell apart in a way. I was giving farewell parties to my team members and my co-founders. I closed my Mumbai office. My Delhi office came to a standstill. Then my only co-founder, the last man standing, told me that he'd leave. Then he left. Then I started another company. And while it was picking up, COVID happened. And I was literally, it was a jolting thing, because we were in particularly that industry which would have been hit most. And then we reinvented ourselves. And then COVID again happened. So I am not the guy who can feel demotivated by listening to my fellow brothers' stories, the entrepreneurs who've been featured in, because I feel for their characters, because I'm in their shoes. But I was just talking as a reader, because when we read books, I've generally noticed people try to like position the story in a way that it's the all inclusive, the what you call it, the aftertaste is not uh somber. You get it? The aftertaste is very bright and chirpy. That's what people try to, and it feels sugar coated to me. It doesn't feel honest. But this particular book was brutally honest. It was how it was. And that's a choice that I thought the author has made consciously, because he chose to not, try to brighten things up uh, as it goes. So no, it didn't bring me down at all. But as a reader, I got concerned that it might do to other people. That's
Okay,
why I
we
was
will
just
find
asking.
out. The world will tell us, right? So one of the entrepreneurs that was featured in there, he taught me something. So there's a gentleman by name R.T. Isaac. He's become a good friend. So one of the key points he makes is you should decide which is your story to tell and which is someone else's story to tell. So in this case, I'm telling the stories of these 17, 18 people or 20 people, and I need to tell their story in their words and not spin it, right?
Mhm.
But if you look at it again, and maybe my own biases show up here, every one of these people financially have done exceptionally well. Not necessarily with the story that I featured,
Mhm.
but they haven't done financially well without these experiences. So obviously, I think attitude, I think that's the message I want people to, take away from this. And hopefully that's clear, which is, look, at the end of the day, the three things we touched upon, one is luck. We don't talk enough about luck.
Yeah.
Two, the other part is you have agency. When shit happens, you can decide how you want to respond to it and not just react to it. And in a way, I view the message of the book very life affirming, which is if you have clarity on what you want and what people around you want, and if you plan, good stuff will happen. Will it happen the first time you try it? I don't know, right? But better come into it knowing what is it that you want. Because I think most unhappiness stems, particularly for entrepreneurs, from not knowing what they want. So that's the worst case. Think about it, Nishant. The world thinks you're successful and you're not happy. That's a lot shittier place to be in.
I agree with you. I do not disagree at all. So this is this conversation, I just feel I should keep having it, and I have so many more questions to ask, but I think we've covered decent bit for our viewers, and now I would not read out the book for them. So what I love Nassim Taleb when he says, it's not my job to read out the book to people who have not read it or who won't read it. So now that we've created nice context, I would like people, aspiring entrepreneurs, experienced entrepreneurs, to pick up this book, give it their 12 to 15 hours, and learn about some real entrepreneurs, who've had some real stories about exit. So with this, I would bring it to a close, sir. I hope you had a nice time talking about us. Please tell people in your words why they should read The Art of Happy Exit.
Firstly, thank you for having me here. The reason is very simple. Whenever we read other people's journeys, the story of other people's journeys, it informs us. So we get a chance to make our own mistakes rather than repeat the mistakes that others have done. So that is first and foremost. Second is the moment we realize, right, and I think this is true for the pandemic and is equally true here, is the moment you realize that you're not alone, it lifts a lot of weight of you, right? It doesn't change the circumstance around you, right? And finally, much like many other books that people have looked at, and particularly when I look at the Gita or books like that, the ultimate truth is really what the entrepreneur's journey is as well. Know thyself. And I think while we are all told know thyself, and that's easy to say and hard to do, reading the book will give you a sense of how have others managed it, and therefore how can you go about it. So it's a very practical book, and I'm hoping that it will help you with whatever it is that you're trying to get done. That's the reason you should read the book.
That is such a beautiful articulation of the book. Now, the people who watch this, I'm so thankful they do. Please do pick up The Art of Happy Exit, because as you saw, the author is a beautiful person inside out, and he's such a good and reasonable man when it comes to telling stories. And I'm sure you'll enjoy this one. Thank you for watching. See you again. Please take care.
Thank you.